Well, hey, y'all. Welcome to the Cultivate podcast. We are so glad that you are with us, where we have been discussing practices related to community.
Yeah.
And in particular, today we're going to be talking about neighboring and the significant role that neighboring played in the health and the growth of the early church. I think sometimes we can very quickly overlook how important simply connecting with others was to the early church, right, and how it was connected to their growth and their health.
Yep. I think it was a major part of the start of church, right? Mm-hmm. The church and the growth. But I think it is something that we don't understand in the same capacity that maybe they lived it out. And so coming back to this idea of neighboring, I think is important right now.
Yeah, I think it really is.
So the first thing I think of course, when I hear neighbor,
yes,
and we're going to date ourselves right now, is Mr. Rogers.
Yes, the ideal neighborhood.
We grew up on
perfect.
Mr. Rogers, coming in.
It was the perfect neighborhood.
Changing into his sweater.
Yeah, changing shoes.
Engaging his neighbors.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Talking about being kind. Mm-hmm. Maybe the next generation, it's Daniel Tiger.
Daniel Tiger.
That's like our kids.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It actually took me a while to realize when they watched that was a spinoff.
A spinoff of Mr.
I thought
Rogers.
It was its own thing. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's important. Mm-hmm. But I think that's why those are so impactful. Like even the idea that we remember that song, "Won't You Be My Neighbor," right? Like that has an impact on us.
It does.
And so, but I think taking it all the way back to the importance of it in Jesus is really significant too. Mm-hmm. So
that's very true.
So let's talk about the fact that we are using the word neighboring. Mm-hmm. Right? Because we think of neighbor as a noun. Right. Now we're using it as a verb.
Right.
Is this just what we do? We just turn everything into a verb nowadays?
Right now, everyone does. If you think, especially like I was thinking of adulting.
Yes.
Is now a thing.
It is a thing.
And so that has become, and now isn't like, I'm mom so hard. Don't you say things like that? Don't
I guess so.
Ladies say things like that. So I think we turn a lot of nouns into verbs these days. Do. Google.
Yeah, I'm Googling this.
Yeah. So
that's true.
I think Jesus, again, trendsetter.
Yeah.
I think if you look at his teaching and his life, what you see is him actually shifting this word from a noun to a verb, because you have this Old Testament concept that we all know and love, that Jesus said, the entire Old Testament can be summed up: love God and love others. Mm-hmm. And really it was love your neighbor is the verse that he was quoting.
Right.
And so you have there this Old Testament concept, and he uses neighbor there as a noun. But then when a guy asks him, so who is my neighbor? He tells the story of the Good Samaritan, and he ends with, so who was a neighbor to the man on the side of the road? And yes, it's still a noun, but the idea there is Jesus is pressing his followers to act like a neighbor, to do the work of neighboring, or to shorten it to neighbor.
Oh, wow. Look at Jesus.
Yeah. And
what
so instead of it being about this noun, neighbor, and trying to identify who is my neighbor, therefore that will influence how I will treat them, what Jesus was saying is you should neighbor everybody.
Oh, that's good.
That's what we're called to do, is to neighbor everybody. And then I explain this as we really get into the practice a little bit more deeply, but Jesus himself neighbored, which is really cool. If you look at the Message version of John 1:14, where it says, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us.
Okay.
The Message version, Eugene Peterson, and the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood.
Oh, I love that version.
And it really is a very
That's good.
Great description of what that Greek word dwells among us is trying to say, that Jesus became our neighbor and he neighbored us.
That's good.
So,
So neighboring is a verb.
Yep.
Thank you, Jesus.
Yep. And the way we're kind of defining it for our purposes with Cultivate is simply creating space to connect with others. It's
pretty
really
simple
very
then.
simple.
It doesn't sound as daunting as maybe the way we tend to think of it.
Right. Yep.
I also think one of the things we want to talk about here is what is a way we can neighbor well. And I think it's good to think about, well, I think one of the things we do think about is hospitality, but I think we want to kind of redefine, in a sense, hospitality. Of course, definitions. I always go back to definitions. It's a good place to just start and then go from there.
Let me say, as you're doing that, so neighboring can be a lot of things.
Right, of
I think
course.
Hospitality is one expression of neighboring.
Right.
That we want to broaden our understanding of hospitality
Right. Beyond just being a good host.
Dinner party.
Yeah, a dinner party.
Yep.
Totally, because that's what Jesus is redefining with neighboring.
Yep.
So
Yep.
maybe what we want to say here is how to understand hospitality different from maybe just culturally what we think of with hospitality. So going back to Google, I Googled it.
Nice.
Hospitality is the relationship of a host towards a guest, wherein the host receives the guest in some amount of goodwill and welcome. I actually think that's a great definition.
Yeah, I like that a lot. The receiving piece is really good.
Yeah, because it doesn't necessarily mean I am receiving them into my home or my space, but you're receiving them into yourself more, and the space just happens to be where you choose it, right?
Which is, I had a friend recently mention to me, he said, isn't it true that what Jesus did was he just came to create space for others?
Like, that's good.
He didn't come to create, but in his ministry, he was constantly creating space for others. He was receiving them into his world.
Yep.
And so he really kind of sets the model there.
That's so true. So I think I like to also go into a deep dive of like hospitality. When you think of hospitality in history and how it kind of evolved, I also found that the term hospitality was derived from a French word, which is hospice, which actually means taking care of the travelers. So like people who would, this was like way back in the day, people would travel through, right, by foot. Like think of Jesus and his disciples traveling. You're walking long distances and you need a place to stay. And guess what? There's no hotels.
Right.
Because hotels didn't exist yet. You couldn't
bad.
just go buy a room.
No Best Western.
No.
It's too bad.
And so what people would have are these like rooms in their houses where travelers would come and stay. And that was actually hospitality. That was offering hospice. Like these weary travelers, I'm bringing them into my house and I'm letting them stay in kind of our extra space. And it was very cultural, even in Jesus's day and beyond, to especially the early church was very known for this, of really leaving extra space in your home for those people, which is such a foreign concept to us. We might have a guest bedroom. I think most people might have a guest bedroom that you are very selective with who's allowed in your guest bedroom. If a weary traveler just showed up at your front door, you might not want to bring them in your guest bedroom.
Is so true.
But that was a form of hospitality. That's kind of where this idea of hospitality came from. They would even put people in like just wherever they could because they knew they were tired. They would bring them in and let them stay in their homes. It's also like this idea is what helped us form hospitals. It's what helped us form, back then it was inns and now hotels and now
hostels.
Hostels, exactly. And so the idea of hospitality, which started as I'm helping someone along their path and their journey. I don't even know them, but I know they're weary and tired and I have something to offer them and I'm receiving them in as a guest and I'm helping them along their way. I think that is a way we don't think about hospitality for sure.
And you think about, I wonder, we could never necessarily directly trace all this back, but you wonder, I have heard that they called these little rooms Christ rooms. It was your Christ room that you just had reserved, and you just kept that space. You created that space for anybody who needed it. I'm imagining when those people would come into your house, maybe they would encounter the gospel, right? Like they would hear about Jesus. They would hear about, why are you doing this? And all of that. And maybe they give their life to Jesus and they go about their way. And there's no telling how that message would spread from there. And so to contrast that with a more modern day version of, you could say, evangelism, which is more us entering into other people's spaces.
Yes.
Like we need to stand on a street corner and have a sign, or we need to make sure we're bold and we go and tell these people the truth. This is more creating space within your world where hopefully Jesus is the center and inviting people into that.
Yep.
So they can experience it in a very organic and natural way. That's really interesting.
Because you're also offering up, you're not just offering up the things that you might have, but you're also offering up who you are.
Yep.
And if you're a follower of Christ, you're offering up love and peace and joy
Right.
and what's living inside you, right? That's the idea with that. I think
That's
it's
really
also
great.
neat to think about it in biblical hospitality. I think first I kind of was thinking about it and I thought, oh my gosh, this is what Abraham and Sarah did when they received the strangers
Oh, yeah.
that came to them.
Yeah.
They didn't even know these
Right.
people,
Yep.
angels, whatever we think they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
God, probably. And they offered hospitality to them, even if they didn't, even though before they knew them. And that was kind of like the concept of I'm welcoming someone in. I even read that some people would welcome people in, whether they knew if they were like, if they could have potentially been an enemy, so to speak,
Yeah.
quote unquote. It was a way, hospitality was a way to make them an ally, is what I read. And so the idea of me opening
yeah.
myself up, offering something up, it's a level of vulnerability, really, too.
Big time. Huge.
And you're welcoming them in and you're creating a relationship. You're building
Yeah.
a foundation of something that really God can use
Yep.
powerfully. And so I immediately thought of like Abraham and Sarah, and I thought that was a really early on great example.
It is,
of
yeah. And then if you
hospitality.
fast forward into Hebrews and you think about the passage that says, and some of you will host angels.
Oh yeah.
And just there's this assumption there that you that this is just a part of Christian practice.
Right.
Is that you opened your space up to those around you.
That is cool to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So I also thought it was interesting. I read that what we tend to think hospitality, and I know just because being a woman, like you think, oh, I have to keep a nice home. It needs to be ready to receive people. I have to set a good table or decoration. Well, actually, traditionally, hospitality was male dominant.
Interesting. Because most guys hear that word these days.
And they assume a woman.
They check out.
And actually, it was more the men who were the ones welcoming people into their home. And it actually, I mean, you know, it was a more patriarchal culture back
Yeah.
then. So it was true that the man was the one saying, hey, come into my home. But it was also a very intimate and vulnerable thing for a man to do. And so for that to happen, it was just really sweet and special. And I don't know. I thought that was really interesting that is so
Yes.
different from what we think of today. That's why it's
and
good to
maybe
think about
just
this.
we just think of that way in America.
Probably.
Because I think of your dad, who
Oh,
was
yeah.
a great host.
Yep. It's very much. He's Persian, so
And so-
very much their culture.
Yeah. And so you wonder if it's just more of an American problem where we don't
I think it might be.
equate kind of hospitality with things that a man would do. But
Yep.
globally, I think it's a little bit more universal.
So then how, knowing all this now,
Okay.
what are some ways, because we don't want to just leave everyone with information, what
Yep.
are ways that we can, thinking about biblical hospitality, thinking about historically, and even the way Jesus is calling us to neighbor, what are ways that we can do this, put this into practice?
Yeah, I think we can think of the question like, what do I have to offer?
Yeah, that's a
As
better way.
kind of, a way to, what do I have to offer those around me that then will allow me to receive them, if that makes sense. And so I think there's a few different ways we could ask this question. So, for instance, what interests do you have to offer?
Oh, that's good.
Like, what are you into that can actually be a way to create space to connect with others? And so we've got a good friend who started a running club in his
Yep.
neighborhood because he's a runner.
Yep.
And now he gathers with this little crew, once a week, and they go on an early morning run.
Well, that's a good idea.
I think it might feel like a stretch of hospitality. I don't think it is. I think
No.
that is an act of hospitality,
I
of
think so.
hosting others, receiving them. Cooking is kind of the traditional example. I was thinking about this, like gaming, people who are like into gaming, but it's like you can build, a group around that. You
Yeah,
can create
now
a
you can.
space to
Totally.
do this together, whether you do it in person or whether you do it, online. Tutoring, which might feel more like offering a service, but you're making yourself available. You're creating a space
Right.
to offer something to somebody else so that they can enter into your space. In
I,
your world.
I have a girl in our women's ministry who just this summer opened up her home to do a cooking class for kids.
Oh,
So
that's great.
some of her other neighbors and mom friends were literally
idea.
dropping off kids at her house for the morning, and they were doing a little kids cooking class. And I thought that is a great example of neighboring and hospitality. She had something to offer, and she opened her home up to do that in a unique way.
Yeah. So it can be something that you're actually interested in. Right. You're genuinely interested in. It doesn't have to be something that you kind of have to force yourself into so that you can connect. The second one is, what resources do you have to offer? A lot of times we might think, well, I don't have a house big enough to host, or going back to interests, I don't like to cook. And so I guess just check me. Right. I'm not a hospitality person. I don't have that gift. That's not my thing. But all of us have some kind of resources. And I always think of our neighbor, Bob. Yes. Whose basement is just like a hardware store. Yes, every tool on the planet that's ever been made in the last 50 years is down there. And every time I go down there, we have great conversation. I'm shopping through his stuff, looking for something I need to fix something. Yep. And we have a great time together. And it's just a way that he actually receives me into his world. Because he has kind of something to offer.
He's a great neighbor. Yeah. Everyone needs a neighbor with tools. I know. Or maybe you're that neighbor.
We don't need as many.
No, just share them. We actually have neighbors who we watch share their lawnmower back and forth. Like that's also a way to be a good neighbor.
It is.
Sharing your resources. We have friends who are blessed to have boats, and they'll take us out on a boat for the day or things like that. And I think when you are blessed with some things that other people around you may not have, I think it is a good way. That is an offering of hospitality. You're inviting them in. You're offering something to them and receiving them and helping them in a way, right?
Yeah, that's a good one. All right, the next question could be, what settings do you have to offer? And I guess what I mean by that is like contexts. Like where do you find yourself? That you can actually, where you are, you can actually just create space where you are.
It's not just your home.
Right. So and you don't have to like put on a whole thing. Like you just open your eyes to what you're already around. So, if your kid plays for, a soccer team, is there a way to, you're the person that brings brownies and sits with all the parents in the stands and hands out brownies, and y'all talk as you watch the game together.
Yes.
Like that's
a great idea.
Act of, you're just looking at a setting that you have. I was thinking of students who, move from one class to the next, like in college, and you've usually got like a 15 to 20 minute break. There's a setting where you could use that to create space for somebody else.
That's really good.
Offer them, hey, let's go grab some coffee together or something like that. I think we have more settings in our lives that people can enter into that we just assume they're our setting, right? This is my time to get my stuff done because we're always so busy. But when we begin to look at things a little bit differently, you could look at your yard, your office, like where do you just generally find yourself, and ask yourself the question of like, how could I actually create a hospitable environment where I already am on a regular basis?
I think that's good. And then I think the last one is the key to all of it. Let's be honest. What time do you have to offer?
Yeah.
I think time is our most precious commodity as people right now. And so to offer it, we are so careful with what we offer. Sometimes we're so careful and sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're actually very flippant in what we do with our time. And so I think if we're intentional with this idea, we're intentional with this practice of neighboring, then I think we'll look at our time differently, right? And we'll choose the things, like you said, you can already look at the places you're in and say, okay, how am I going to use this time that I'm here wisely? Maybe you're just in an office space all day long and you're like, I have no time to be a good neighbor. Well, maybe you're a coworker. You can be a good neighbor right there at your coworker. Invite them to lunch instead of maybe sticking your AirPods in and sitting by yourself. Or maybe you have a shared office space and bring donuts the next time to your office space. I promise you will make neighbors there.
Right.
They will love your office space if you are the one that's bringing hospitality to that space. So what spaces and what amount of time do you have in those spaces that you can offer things, right?
Yeah, and I think always evaluating our time in the context of hospitality or neighboring is important because things change, our schedules change.
Right.
And our tendency is just, if time opens up anywhere in our lives, we just refill it with whatever
do.
else we need to do. And
know.
even the example from this last weekend where we're at church and you had this aha moment of, wait, our daughter who now drives can
Yes.
take all of our kids home, and we could invite
We have
somebody out the way. And we have this
freedom.
long list of people that we want to
Yes.
do lunches with. And so now Sundays after church becomes an opportunity
do
for us.
lunch,
And we
yeah.
didn't have that time last year, but we do
Right.
have that time this year. And so, I think always auditing all of these areas, resources, interests, settings, and time,
Right.
evaluating and really just asking the Lord, where and what of these areas can I practice hospitality? Can I
Yep.
create space for others?
I think more than anything in all of this, though, like you have to keep the focus. The focus isn't on you. It's
Right.
on the other person. And that's what the whole thing about hospitality and neighboring is. I
That's
love Ann Voskamp has this quote that says, entertaining elevates the host while hospitality elevates the guest.
Ooh,
And I think it
that's
keeps
really good.
in mind
Yeah.
that this is about the other person.
Mm-hmm.
This is about who I am loving and reaching and caring for and building relationship with, right? Because this is what we're talking about. It's all about community. Sometimes to do that, sometimes we do some introspection.
Yeah.
But this week we're talking about, what am I doing to think of others? What am I doing outside of myself? So this
That's
is a
so
good week
good.
to think about that.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well said. Yep.
Well, thank you all for joining us this week. And
Yeah.
hopefully you can become a better neighbor as you neighbor others.
Yes.
And hopefully use hospitality and maybe stretch yourself a little bit in
Yeah.
ways of practicing hospitality and being a good neighbor to others.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us.
All right.